Hello, I'm Erik Waite, and this is lesson 7 in our study of Christian Worldview Apologetics. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the Christian worldview versus pseudo-science. There are texts that appear to be in conflict with modern science. However, the real issue between the conflict between people who claim to be scientifically minded and Christians is the question of miracles. Well, first, supernatural miracles have always been a great stumbling block to the natural man, even during the time of Jesus and the apostles. As Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14, the natural person, psychikos, does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned or judged. Anakrinetai in the Greek. They may claim seeing is believing, but this is not true of the empiricists today, nor of those during Jesus' earthly ministry. As we read in Matthew 28, verses 16 to 17, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. The empiricist rationalist, who claims to limit to what we can know, to what can be proven scientifically, will always explain away or be blind to what does not fit within his presupposed worldview unless the Spirit of God converts him and opens his eyes. The word science is from the Latin word scientia, which means to know. So science should be keenly concerned with developing a justifiable epistemology. The word epistemology comes from the Greek word episteme, which means to know or knowledge. Yet when studying a scientific discipline such as zoology, biology, astrophysics, chemistry, botany, and so forth, in a university, rarely, if ever, do they even raise the question, how can we have a true, justifiable belief, which is the very definition of knowledge? A claim to knowledge must be true. To say I know 2 plus 2 equals 5 is a falsehood and cannot be a claim to true knowledge. Second, a claim to knowledge must be justifiable. An accurate guess, such as predicting who will win the Super Bowl, is not the same thing as a justifiable claim to knowledge unless a person had an insider knowledge that the losing team was going to be intentionally losing the game. A claim to knowledge that is true but cannot be claimed based on one's worldview is actually borrowing from another worldview which can provide a justifiable epistemology. The empiricist cannot make any claim to knowledge of that which is not observable by the senses, such as the preconditions of knowledge, the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, nor make any universal claim since the empiricist cannot observe all things at all times. Likewise, the rationalist, who makes claims of knowledge based upon only what can be reasoned within his own mind, cannot know anything outside of his own mind. For to him, all of life may be a mere illusion, as we may only exist within a computer program, like in the movie The Matrix. Third, a claim to knowledge must be believed. A liar can say Jesus rose from the dead, but such a statement cannot be a claim to knowledge, for they do not believe it. Those who discount the Bible because of its recorded miracles do so on a presupposed naturalism rather than on any true empirical evidence. The denial of miracles is not based on empirical observation, but a preconceived bias of the empiricist rationalist worldview. This is true not only for the atheist scientist, but also for the scholar in the Bible-denying seminary and denomination. Anti-supernaturalism is the driving presupposition of higher criticism modern liberal theologians, as well as their early counterparts, such as Adolf von Harnack, Albrecht Reichel, C.H. Weiss, George Hegel, H.E.G. Paulus, Herman Samuel Ramirez, Martin Kahler, Rudolf Bultmann, or William Reid. How then should we approach alleged discrepancies in this category? First, always recognize that the real problem is a philosophical problem which is behind any scientific approach. Second, we must remember that the historical validity of miracles is not determined by empirical proof, but by credible witness. Third, miracles were signs that were related to the revelation of God's person and or his purposes. They are not normative for human history. Most alleged scientific problems of the Bible may be adequately answered in spite of the fact that the naturalists will continue to disbelieve the evidence. The scientific method. The scientific method is a systematic approach to inquiry that involves 7 key steps: observation, question, hypothesis, experiment, data analysis, conclusion, and communication. In order to be tested, the phenomenon needs to be observable by at least one of the 5 senses. It must also be verifiable by being repeated in a controlled experiment. The one conducting the experiment must avoid logical fallacies such as post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacies, which means this phenomenon happened after this action, therefore this action is the cause of this phenomenon, in which one fails to prove cause and effect. The scientific method is a valid means of conducting experiments, but it is limited. In order to use the scientific method, one must first assume certain transcendentals that are necessary preconditions for intelligibility, such as the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and the reliability of the senses. As stated in previous lessons, the empiricist rationalist worldview cannot provide a justifiable epistemology and worldview. Therefore, to rely solely on the scientific method as a means of knowing and believing is to adhere to a very limited epistemology. A fool begins with a flawed presupposition for his worldview, with an epistemology that cannot account for the necessary preconditions for intelligibility, as I said, such as the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, or a universal standard for ethics. In order to conduct science, the fool has to borrow from another worldview that can account for such things. The scientific method is valid, but limited. It cannot provide an entire justifiable worldview. The fool demands that the existence of God be tested according to his flawed epistemological presuppositions. But to do so would be to answer a fool according to his foolishness. But the Bible tells us, do not answer a fool according to his foolishness, or else you'll be like him. Answer a fool as his foolishness deserves, so that he will not be wise in his own eyes. Proverbs 26, verses 4-5. Galileo versus science? Scientists are not unbiased investigators who wear lab coats. The various scientific fields are influenced and impacted by political, philosophical, and economic influences. A German physicist named Sabine Hofsfelder talks a great deal about this on her YouTube channel. So when someone proclaims, scientists all agree that, you need to question the statement. What kind of scientists? Chemists? Physicists? Biologists? Geologists? Second, is there really uniformity amongst all scientists of every field of study? Third, is there any economic, social, or political coercion putting pressure on scientists whose reputation, career, and livelihood depends on them acquiescing to the will of the majority? Fourth, do we have any recent examples of the media and political powers telling us to follow the science, only for us to find out a couple years later that the message was being controlled by those who had a political and economic incentive to threaten the masses to conform with the propaganda? Were there other doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists being threatened if they spoke out against the so-called science? Were social media platforms being controlled by the government to get people to conform with the message? The doctrine of evolution as taught by the worldview, philosophy, or religion of neo-Darwinism is antithetical to the biblical Christian worldview. Yet ignorant Christians will insist that to not use a neo-Darwinian interpretation of Genesis 1 is akin to repeating the error of those who condemned the heliocentric theory of Galileo, stating that it was contrary to Scripture when it states, "He set the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved." Psalm 104, see also 1 Chronicles 16:30. They will then go on to argue that just as the Roman Catholic Church was wrong about Galileo Galilei, so too the Church has been wrong about Darwinian evolution. To not allow for the infusion of the neo-Darwinian worldview with the biblical worldview is to be anti-scientific, which is a very bad testimony to the world. It's not that we need empiricism under the guise of science to correct our interpretation of the Bible. What we need is a hermeneutic that is consistent with how humans speak normally in Scripture that corrects our interpretation of the Bible. The failure to recognize phenomenological language, that is, speaking according to appearances, in the Bible, such as Psalm 104, verse 5, and insist that the sun revolves around the earth is a hermeneutical error, not a failure to harmonize Scripture with a Darwinist interpretation of the world. The fact is, during Galileo's time, the prevailing scientific view was geocentric, that the earth was the center of the universe. This view, largely based on the theories of Ptolemy, was widely accepted and upheld by the church. So it was not Galileo versus the church, or Galileo versus the Bible, but rather Galileo versus science. Anyone who claims otherwise is distorting the truth, and anyone who claims a sixth day of creation was first taught by Ellen G. White, the founder of Seventh-day Adventists, is distorting the truth, especially if they claim to be Presbyterian. Virtually all of the Westminster divines, that is, those who wrote the Westminster Confession, believed in a literal sixth-day creation. They urged this view because they believed in the truthfulness of the Bible, not only in its redemptive message, but also in its teaching on the history of creation, particularly in light of Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, which states, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." The concept of remembering is found throughout the Old and New Testaments. The Hebrew word is zakar, and the New Testament equivalence is anamnesin. Whenever the Lord's people are called to remember, particularly when it is tied to a memorial or feast day, it is an actual historical event. For example, the Israelites were called to remember the day of their deliverance with Passover, as we read in Exodus 12:14. "This day will be a day of remembrance for you, which your future generations will celebrate with pilgrimage to the Lord. You will celebrate it as a statute forever." And the Lord's Supper in the New Testament in Luke 22:19. "And when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body which is being given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" The correspondence of remembering of actual historical events with the memorial is consistent throughout Scripture. In light of Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11, to interpret the creation week in Genesis 1 as not being a historical event goes contrary to the entirety of Scripture and how it uses the concept of remember. The Bible uses the term 352 times. If the creation week of Genesis 1 is not a record of a historical event, then Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 is the singular text in which the word remember is not being used in reference to a historical event. While I would not suggest that we should interpret a passage such as Genesis 1 solely on the meaning of a singular word found elsewhere in the Bible, it should give us pause to question other interpretations of the text. There is so much that could be said on this subject. I could do a 10-part series, entire video series, on this issue alone, and there are other organizations and teachers and pastors and theologians and scientists who spend a great deal of time on this particular issue. My primary concern is that anytime something is claimed to be universally asserted or believed by scientists, that claim should be questioned. Now, obviously, there are certain things that are universally claimed by scientists, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, I don't think we need to question that one. But there are a lot of other claims that are made that within a few years we find out are not to be the case. So, to base our worldview and our interpretation on Genesis 1 based on a particular philosophy of neo-Darwinism, I would assert is absolutely foolish. Alrighty, hope you have benefited from this lesson, and until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.